And first, it might be good to start with introductions, since we have some different faces here today. We can just kind of round robin it, and then we'll do announcements and jump into the discussion. So I'll start, and then we can just popcorn to other people. My name is Gina Pirelli Duranlo. I am, sorry, have more people come into the waiting room. There we go. I am the Clean Program Coordinator, so I work with Katie Boyd, who's here at Series Education and Outreach, where Clean is housed. And I'll popcorn it to Eric.
Thanks, Gina. And yeah, thanks, Joe, for jumping in today. Excuse me. I'm Eric Havel. I'm located here in the Bay Area, Oakland, California, climate science educator for the better part of about 30 years, focused on climate science education in informal, sort of at the sort of emanating from informal education spaces. I was at a science center here in Oakland for about 22 years full-time, and still there part-time doing professional development, but also do a lot of work with formal educators and professional development workshops and things. And then just have a keen interest on the whole COP process in the last couple of years. Have started to engage in that more actively. I've never been in person, but have done some digital involvement. So Frank and I are working on a project that he's been spearheading around that. So kind of making that connection, and maybe I'll popcorn over to Frank to add on to that.
Okay, first question is, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. I'm asking that question because, as you probably noticed from the placard in back of me, I'm sitting in a waiting room for a set of doctor's offices. So I'm probably not going to say much during this call and rely on the chat a lot to communicate. Anyway, I'm Frank Grenshaw. I'm from here in Portland, Oregon. I am a retired community college geoscience instructor who's been to several COPs, and also am involved currently teaching at Portland State, doing climate science for non-science majors. It's my idea of retirement. And as Eric mentioned, involved with trying to encourage the development of hubs for remote engagement for COPs. And at this point, I am going to hand it over to Lynn.
Thanks, Frank. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm Lynn Pender. I'm in Baltimore, Maryland. I am an adult educator. I run a GED program with my church, and I also work at several adult literacy organizations here in Baltimore. One of the things that attracted me to this group is that I'm really interested in working to infuse climate education into adult education curricula. And I'm also co-founder of an organization here in Baltimore called the Baltimore Green Justice Workers Cooperative. And I'm really excited about working with Frank and Eric even to organize and work with some communities that we're associated with to possibly be a hub for COP 28. I'll popcorn it over to James.
Great, thanks, Lynn. James Callahan, for like Eric, for over 25 years now, an educator and mentor to multi-generational teams on action on climate change. Maybe to pick an example of it, with mobile climate science labs and climatechangeeducation.org, one is working with multi-generational teams now internationally on both, certainly in Washington, D.C., California, and Maryland, in action that students can take that is very serious, like the building behind me. the students are making that building more energy efficient and doing some of the most famous buildings in the country. So that's real action. It's not just plans, it's real action. And seeing that diverse young people are taken seriously in making contributions to climate action. So how about let's go over to Christy.
Hi, thanks, Jim. I'm Christy Buffington. I live and work on the lands of the Lower Tanana Dene people in Alaska. And I work at the Trothieta campus of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I've been involved in education since 1997, 96. And I both a hat of being an environmental scientist and also as an educator, both in the informal spaces. And I spent time as a classroom teacher as well. And at UAF, I teach undergraduates. And we use GLOBE here in Alaska for science, community science. So I do a lot. I'm actually in the airport right now, and I'm heading over to Juneau, Alaska this week to do a culturally responsive or sustaining training with Tlingit teachers who are integrating culture and science. So GLOBE stands for Global Learning and Observations to Benefit the Environment. And it's a really fun way to collect data, get that data entered, and then give students an opportunity to present their work, both at a regional symposium or an international virtual symposium. So those are some of the things that I'm trying to braid together. I've been intermittent on clean. So thanks for having me back today because it's 9 o'clock Alaska time, and I always have meetings at 9 o'clock on Tuesday. So I'll always learn so much from everyone here when I come. So I will stop my introduction here. I'll mute, and I may turn my camera off just because it is an airport and I found a quiet spot. Popcorn over to Karen. Karen Hallweg, I think, just joined.
Hi, I just joined. I don't know what you're doing.
Introductions,
Karen,
Karen.
we're
Yeah,
just
just
doing
give us
introductions, and I couldn't remember who has gone and who hasn't, but since I saw you pop up, I'm like, ooh, that's a good one. Karen.
Okay. Thanks, Christy. I'm Karen Holweg. I'm in Colorado, and I'm retired.
Let's see. Thanks for joining, Karen. Who hasn't gone yet? Carolyn, Rachel, Emily.
Yeah, my name is Rachel Renbarger. I'm at FHI 360, which is a global nonprofit, and we are working in climate change education, mostly in the K-12 space, but we also have a sister department working on adult learning, higher education, and we do a lot of out of school times. Just glad to see a lot of y'all in this space as well. I'm a researcher myself, so happy to be here. And yes, Carolyn, have you gone?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Carolyn. I work for a nonprofit called the Clio Institute, focused in the state of Florida. I'm in the Tallahassee office. We do climate education and advocacy with a lot of focus on climate and environmental justice. My role is education and curriculum manager. So we work a lot with high school, college students, and yeah, developing like student advocacy programs. I was late, so I'm not entirely sure who all has gone and who hasn't.
I haven't. I'll jump in.
Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Boyd. I am the Clean Program Manager, and Clean and I are based at Series Education and Outreach. So I do some work on other projects there too, mostly evaluation, but my main focus is Clean. So nice to have you all here today. I think, Emily, are you the last one who has not introduced yourself yet?
I might be. I know I haven't gone. I also came late. Carolyn, so you're not the only one. My name is Emily Snowd Brenneman, and I'm with UCAR and UCAR Center for Science Education in Boulder. We're based in Boulder, Colorado. We do a lot. We work a lot with, especially my team, K-12 education, but we also do work with the SOARS program, which is a bridge program from undergraduate to graduate. And then we have websites, we have teacher resources, we do a lot of different things, and I wear a lot of different hats as a program specialist, but right now I'm focusing most on exhibits, because at the NCAR Mesa Lab in Boulder, we have exhibits on weather, climate, and sun and space weather. And so doing a lot of work there as well. And I believe that's everyone. If not, please someone speak up. Thanks.
And the main guy himself, Joe.
Yeah. I was just gonna transition to that. So yes, I'll let Joe introduce himself. And maybe Joe, if you're feeling up for it, a little rundown on the People's Pavilion. And we can transition into questions and that type of thing as well.
Sure. Sounds good. It's great to be with you all. My name is Joe Robertson. I'm Executive Director of Citizens Climate International. CCI was founded in early 2021 to take on full-time the international program of Citizens Climate Lobby and Citizens Climate Education. Many of you may know Citizens Climate Lobby organizes citizen volunteers who talk to their members of Congress throughout the United States. And CCI now works with citizen volunteers in that capacity in 76 other countries. We have active local chapters in 51 countries and 25 more in development, going through training and movement building. We have 4 programs. Volunteer empowerment is one of them. Another one we call civic diplomacy. That is where we engage intergovernmental processes like the UN climate change negotiations. We have a carbon pricing program. So not just advocacy through our volunteers, but also working to develop principles and standards that can apply in different contexts around the world, and working with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. And we have a 4th program we call Resilience Intelligence, which is essentially a way of looking at the overall performance against sustainability and science-based resilience standards. And I'm here today to share a little bit about the People's Pavilion. This is something we started doing the last 2 COPs, starting in Glasgow. Basically, it's a digital engagement venue for people who want to kind of deepen their contact with the intergovernmental negotiations. Some of those people might be participating and be on site, but most are somewhere else in the world. And so we invite people to come in and interact with the negotiating process, interact with people who are there, and live stream whatever events might be available. For reference, our second year, last year, the COP27, there were 400 people registered, 500 events that were live streamed, and 4,500 interactions across 40 countries. We're looking to expand all of those numbers this year. And it's a fascinating thing to create a digital meeting space for people to engage something as big and as complicated as the intergovernmental climate negotiations. Something we've added in sort of under the radar is our partnership with the Fletcher School at Tufts University called the Earth Diplomacy Leadership Initiative. This is a series of workshops. Some of you may have joined them recently. These workshops are designed to prepare people for the UNFCCC negotiating process, which is immensely complex. It has not one global conference of 196 countries, but 5 at the annual COP. That's 5 different agendas of 20 agenda items and multiple sub-items that all need to be gabbled in, negotiated, and gabbled out, with legal text emerging that will change international law. So it's incredibly complex. And it's not that complexity escapes people who are prepared. It's just that if you aren't prepared for it, it takes much longer to kind of get a sense of what's happening. So working with the Fletcher School, we have developed this series of trainings where We take people through the process. We take people through what is at stake in the process, what the science says, where things stand, and then looking at some of the transformational outcomes that are possible. And we'll do a deeper dive with more events in the fall ahead of the COP. But this is relevant to the People's Pavilion because those events are actually hosted through the People's Pavilion. If you're a member there, you can access the events more easily. And there are, reports and briefing notes and all kinds of resources that are shared there in the background, as well as a series of thematic discussions related to elements of the process to create an ongoing community of discussion between observers, diplomats, and future diplomats, people who are training to go into that work. And then, I wanted to share another detail of our work that's relevant to the People's Pavilion, which is something that we call the Engage for Climate Toolkit. So, we're active in the Action for Climate Empowerment segment of the UNFCCC negotiations. Action for Climate Empowerment, I'm sure many of you know, being in education, is about education, information, transparency, and training. It's also about international cooperation and civic participation. And we at Citizens Climate International are very engaged in helping to create models for ongoing stakeholder participation in the design and the implementation of climate policy. So the Engage for Climate Toolkit is essentially a way for people anywhere in any community with any level of expertise or zero to organize policy-focused conversations that can help to inform decision makers. There are a number of different meeting types that people can use. There is guidance on how to produce a report that would be useful to decision makers so that a community of stakeholders can give their input. And there are also recommendations for how you might follow up so that you can build ongoing networks in communities that can help to steward the climate policy going forward. This is something we're now starting to do to create a kind of ongoing global stocktake, not just let the global stocktake play out in the UN environment, but among countries, but bring the perspective of stakeholders and observers to that discussion so that there's not just an observation of what's happening, where the gaps are, but also a projection of what is needed going forward. And then finally, last year, during the COP, one of the things we put out was a report called Capital to Communities, which essentially argues that this type of ongoing stakeholder engagement should be part of the policy process, including in relation to climate finance, designing it, getting ready to deploy it, and then assessing what it's doing and how it's doing over time. So I brought these other threads into this discussion about the People's Pavilion because at COP28, we're going to be looking to tie them all together. We want to have local stakeholder meetings. Some people call them citizens assemblies. They don't all qualify as that, but local meetings that can be sort of satellite events that connect to the COP through the People's Pavilion so that the COP is essentially expanded out to a global landscape. Of course, centers of learning are an excellent place to do that kind of thing because you have people who have organizational capacity, venues and technology and networks, and who can also inform the less well-initiated people in the room about what the stakes are, what's going on, and how they might contribute to policy discussions. So that's something that we might want to follow up on. But the other aspect of the People's Pavilion at COP28 is we're determined to show that stakeholder engagement is of value no matter what political system one might be operating in. And the COP28 presidency, of course, the United Arab Emirates, they have laws in their country that prohibit criticisms of industry, for instance. That's a challenge when you get stakeholders involved because many of the problems stakeholders are facing are caused by industry not being decent, frankly, not doing a good job, not honoring the basic core ethics that we all expect people to honor in interpersonal relations. So how do you have a conversation about climate change without criticizing industry? It's challenging. But what we're looking at is to show that in this type of environment where we're focusing on policy, we're focusing on the transformation of whole economies, it's not relevant whether industry deserves to be criticized. What's relevant is that where industry isn't working, where it isn't able to perform at the level needed to meet the demands of science, to meet the demands of the human right to a clean and healthy environment, well, then something else has to happen. And it's up to that industry to figure out if they can innovate and keep up, or if they're going to bow out and let someone else take over. And that conversation becomes much more the front and center conversation when stakeholders are involved, and they can simply matter-of-factly say, we need development, but it has to be clean. We need jobs, but they have to be friendly to and resilient against climate change. That gets governments talking in a different way. So we're going to be looking to have those kind of conversations in and around the COP28. And a final point is, we're working with a network of partners through the ECOS community, the education, communication, and outreach stakeholders community on, it's a multi-year effort now to see if we can actually establish a physical pavilion presence at the COP. That's challenging for a number of reasons. One is the investment value isn't all that clear. It's a huge investment in terms of capital, and you basically get a bunch of people hanging out together for a couple of weeks. There's some value in that, but in terms of whether all of the different people in that network or who are behind that physical pavilion can actually carry that work forward outside of the COP, there are real questions about whether that's the best use of their time. So that effort needs to be a big coalition effort. It needs to have not 2 or 3 organizations, but dozens of organizations staffing and supporting it to make sure that everybody's free to operate effectively in the COP environment. And the 2 other things that we would want to bring to that physical pavilion, if we're able to do it, is we want to bring this digital global network of engagement so that people around the world are tuned in, tapped into what's happening at the COP. And the other is we would be looking at also hosting media in that environment. In the COP environment, media and press are the least privileged of the different badge holders. The parties, the countries can enter any room that is open to parties as long as they're one of the parties in that smaller group, if it's a smaller group. UN badges, the blue badges, almost any UN agency staff can enter any space except those that are closed and exclusive to parties. Observers have far more access than press do. They can enter any meeting that is open. Press generally cannot enter any meeting except by special invitation to the plenary hall, for instance, on select occasions. Generally, the press are not allowed in any of those rooms. And so they kind of have to hang out together in a huddle. They schedule their own meetings and interviews, and the best do a really good job. They get everything they need, they get the word out, they get some high-level interviews. But a lot of the media don't have the opportunity to really fully engage the process and to really fully immerse themselves in what is happening. They have to hear it from someone else, and they tend to hear complaints, they tend to hear frustration, they tend to hear, the person who is most vocal because they are most annoyed at what just happened. And that tells something of a skewed story of the way the process works. So we are interested in both our digital pavilion and also, again, if we can, the physical pavilion, having and recognizing media, first of all, as an ACE constituency. They are part of the process of telling the story to the public in a truthful way. But also they are non-party stakeholders. They have a stake in whether or not the world has good information and is moving forward on this. And they have the ability to make sure that everybody collectively has better information. So that's an additional piece that we want to create. And on all of these different threads that the People's Pavilion ultimately pulls together, of course, we're interested in hearing from professionals like you that are doing this important work of climate change education. I'll just stop there for now.
Thanks, Joe. That's a really, really great summary. Has anyone here engaged with the online platforms before? Frank probably has. Yeah. And Jen. Yeah. Any questions that are coming up for Joe?
So I'll just unmute and ask a real quick question. Joe, how do we get a copy of the People's Pavilion Toolkit?
That is a great question. I am going to put that in the chat right now. So it's not hosted at the People's Pavilion, but it is hosted in an interactive craft document. Let me just send this to you. Okay, that should take you there.
And I'll throw in one more question here. When you talk about the citizen assemblies and making connections with local folks, I know Istais mentioned in her email that you folks are talking with the Scottish government right now. Is that to sort of capitalize on the experience of climate cafes from 26, or let me ask the question this way: what is the thought in terms of sort of local gatherings that you folks have been discussing?
Yeah, so, I think there's really three key reasons why we think this is important. One is there's a pretty bad track record of governments guessing about climate policies that will work and finding that their people are not happy with that decision. One example is France and the yellow vests. Another example is Nigeria and removing fuel subsidies rather. In both cases, you had what was almost a nationwide rebellion. Allowing people to have a say makes it much more likely that that will be avoided, that governments won't be guessing. Second thing is, even in the US, when we have stakeholder consultations, if you go back to 2014, 2015, the EPA was having hearings on the Clean Power Plan. And for all of the good intentions and for all of the openness of the American government and of that particular administration, those consultations were not really consultative. They were, here's our plan. Let's document what you've said. Here's our plan again. And that tends to be how most advanced democracies have made their climate policy. Technocrats design the policy. It's presented to the public. There might be some public hearings, there might not. And the policy goes forward more or less as designed by technocrats. That's not the same problem as the yellow vests situation, but it's a similar problem. It doesn't necessarily get us the best possible design with the deepest roots in community. And then the third reason is that whether you're living in a democracy or not, if you don't have enough eyes on the problem, you're not really going to know what's going on. And if you don't really know what's going on, and you're living in a world where the delivery of finance, even through the private sector, even for mainstream activities unrelated to the climate, starts to have this component of governance and transparency where if you can't show evidence, you can't get the finance. You're going to start to have pieces of the everyday economy peeling away, not getting the kind of economic support that they need. And so we're trying to think ahead of the curve and recommend to governments that they pay attention to that fact, embrace the need for transparency, and the fact that if they don't get familiar with it soon enough, they may find it harder to finance their everyday operations. So that's the third reason where we really think that it's just worth avoiding that problem.
I might, maybe you'll form into a question, but maybe it's sort of some context for my interest in kind of what you're doing, Joe, and interest in COP. And it's, this last year, there was this emphasis on loss and damages and the idea that the global South is being disproportionately impacted by climate change, but the global north is responsible for more of the emissions. And I think the context of more global involvement in COP, it's a 2-week, as you mentioned, it's a 2-week thing that happens with some other things that happened, like Bonn that just happened. So there are obviously things going on throughout the year, but there's sort of this focus on what happens. And then there's all, as you described, all of this kind of machinery that has to happen to make, once decisions are made, then it reflects in documents that are drawn up and a lot of things that happen. But it feels like the global voice is not present, and that there's been more of a push, and that this is one example of the ways that the global voice of the citizens of the world can be heard and understood. Two pavilions that I'm aware of that did happen in person, physical pavilions, were the Justice Pavilion at COP, and also there's one called the Mediterranean Pavilion, which was the idea of the Mediterranean basin when it was in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, being a Mediterranean climate country. The idea was to bring all these countries together in that region to sort of say, hey, we're one unified, very diverse collective that is sort of reflective of the world. So I think there's value in more voice. And then I think just the idea that even the UN, we've talked about on the Clean Call many times, the UN structure itself is not necessarily equitable, and that most of the global south is not, on the 5 principal members. You don't have India, maybe it is the most populated country, it's emerging to be, it will be soon. And then countries like Brazil, other global southern, Africa is not represented at all. So the idea that, as you're mentioning, to really get to solutions, we need to be inclusive of our global citizenry, and there's all kinds of solution that we can derive from indigenous cultures throughout the world. So I don't know if it's as much of a question as sort of a just how do we really crack this kind of nugget of this nut of us being involved, truly globally, and truly having this be a reflective body so that we can move forward. And it's not just, as you're saying, technocrats creating something that is not meaningful for, very many of us, and doesn't really embody the voice and ideas from the global population. So I think that's, in partnering with Frank to kind of figure out, and Lynn, you're interested in it also, like more voice in, more eyes on, but more voice in too. So it's not just, the observer role, I think, is powerful, as you mentioned, and interesting to hear that has more access than even the press. But yet the next step is, how do we really get that voice to lead into action, right? And to make a difference in what happens at COP.
Yeah, that's really good observation about the fact that the international system is not inherently inclusive. Years ago, a staffer at UN headquarters who said, we're told not to be here during the General Assembly because it gets so busy. Said, this is really more, it's less like a global legislature and more like a country club with snipers on the roof, was the description. Of course, that happens when you have heads of state, but the vagaries of the Security Council, the permanent 5 members being the allies who won World War II as shorthand, there's obviously a lot of interest in reforming that standard for a number of reasons. Each of those 5 have behaved badly at different times over the years, and that leads to the others doing it as well. Inclusion could be a solution to that, but in terms of getting more voices into the process, the global stocktake has started to open that up a little bit. So if you were listening into the technical dialogue and the global stocktake the third technical dialogue just took place, or the third part of the first technical dialogue just took place in Bonn. And this idea that stakeholders need to be consistently consulted it is really continuously mentioned by parties of all different varieties: wealthy, industrialized, low income, marginalized, oil exporting, they're all saying something to that effect in different ways. Then the question is, well, what's the methodology for that? On the one hand, if you formalize it, you will narrow the scope dramatically and far fewer people will be allowed in. On the other hand, if it's not formalized and it's entirely voluntary and spontaneous, then how is it going to be kept up, and who has the means to get their voice heard, right? So that's a tension that we're actively engaging with and trying to figure out, you know, can we find more room for non-party stakeholder voices through the Justice Pavilion, the regional pavilions, the thematic pavilions like food systems, for instance, human rights, health, et cetera. And a lot of the UN agencies are helpful with that. Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization in particular, have, you know, very wide networks, and they work in communities, and they're very interested in seeing those communities have a voice. And they can sometimes act as a voice, or they can be conveners who help to channel that voice into the process. But UN agencies work at the service of the member states, and that's a rule that is constantly repeated in the COP environment. And so while they are playing that role, they're often doing it on the margins, informally, and without as much power as we would imagine they have. And so there's a role for observers, civil society organizations, to kind of come in and uplift those processes and make sure that they're real and robust and ongoing. And then, you know, you mentioned Indigenous peoples, and this is something where in Bonn just now, I had more conversations about this very subject than I have ever had before. People talking about Indigenous knowledge is science. Science is knowledge, and we have modern science that uses certain techniques, but over thousands of years, developing a body of knowledge about a particular region or ecosystem or climate pattern, and the way that knowledge is manifested in language, vocabulary, having 40 words for snow instead of 1 or 2, you know, bodies of Indigenous knowledge and cultural expressions of that knowledge that are lost because of climate change or because people are forced to leave the place where those ideas are most relevant. That is a loss to everyone. It is a loss that can be demonstrated in technical terms, in terms of our overall capability for living on planet Earth. And you can't just relearn things that took thousands of years to develop and to set in. So the awareness of that, I think, is now much more than it has ever been in this particular process. However, it's still a process run by member states who defer to the most powerful, who have a kind of stratified internal structure amongst themselves, and who aren't necessarily sure that they want to give space to these, you know, communities that are not sovereign nations like themselves. They're busy fighting over what they believe is a limited pie as it is. So that's another place where civil society observers who are advocates for ACE and for engagement and stakeholders' voices and justice can help those countries that are interested in using that knowledge, protecting communities, or simply recognizing that satellites can only tell you so much, but people living on the front lines of climate change in the Arctic can tell you a lot that you can't get from a satellite. You know, finding ways to help those countries that are interested in putting practices in place, that's a place where observers have an important role to play.
I see Asatis was just able to join too. Thanks for hopping on, Asatis. It looks like Jim, you have a question.
Sure, and I don't mean to change the subject or anything in a big way, I think, but if you don't mind, Joe, I'd like to pose a question, as this is a chance for general climate educators and you to get together on something. Wanting to see how Citizen Climate International is paying attention to this a bit of a problem that we want to make sure we do well on. Many of us are dealing with workforce development. We work with action on climate change. We're using STEM in climate change. We teach tens of thousands of people. We're more in that realm, which is a little different than the political and lobbying realm, right? And there's different ways in which those happen. Wanting to see how this happens. This has been many examples of this happen. For instance, we will teach at events that will have tens of thousands of people about science, and people will come over and see about climate change. We've had representatives of Citizen Climate Lobby come by our booths and yell at everybody that what we're teaching is wrong and we need to stop it. Okay, in a science environment, specifically, it would be, you are saying that infrared is light. It is heat, and you need to call it heat. Stop teaching about light. Okay, we've had parents of our students who tell kids things that they've learned in their elevator talk, and the kids have to go and show the parents that science, yes, that's good for talking to a politician, but we need to get our science right if we're actually going to use it. You know, if we get it wrong, it may be a nice elevator speech. You get it in one second, 30 seconds, but it doesn't work. Is there anything toward making sure that people know, who do this, that, okay, there's one thing we do when we talk to politicians, but we have to be careful if we get into the lane of climate educators, science educators? Thank you. I know this is a bit of a hard question, but just a chance to talk a little bit.
No, it's a great question. I mean, that definitely goes to the challenge of education and training in itself, right? And so the very thing you've just raised is, I think, one of the reasons that a lot of countries have slow walked action for climate empowerment for 3 decades, because they're concerned that they would spend money and time on something and then people would just go off and do what they want. So I say it that way because Citizens Climate Lobby has a rule, and the one rule is that when you engage with people, you should always do so with admiration, respect, and gratitude for their role. Now, that's often used specifically for lawmakers, but it really is for anyone you engage with. In your own life, in your own time, your own opinions, you can be as fevered as you want to. But in terms of engaging with people who are doing something constructive in the world, even if you don't see it the same way as they do, the rule for Citizens Climate Lobby is you engage with them in a way that shows admiration, respect, and gratitude for their service. And so that type of interaction you're experiencing shouldn't happen. And it certainly shouldn't happen with someone saying that they're representing Citizens Climate Lobby. But you raise an interesting point, which is that also requires some education, that people need to see that what they learn in a laser talk isn't just something that they need to get everyone else to adopt. It's background for how you might think and talk about something. And my advice to them would be, when they're talking to scientists and science educators, listen to those people, learn from them. And then if you like the language in your laser talk better for talking to your climate skeptic member of Congress, then fine, go and do that. But do both of those things respectfully. So, I'm sorry to hear that has happened, but it's certainly not the advice people are given. Yeah. And I do think that, at Citizens Climate International, we're pretty forthright in saying that, science is science. Science is not negotiable, right? And so one of our goals is to help people in decision-making positions understand the science. Our goal is not to convince them to speak about science in a certain way or think about science in a certain way. Our goal when it comes to science is to help them understand what's there, what the evidence shows, and then to think about some things they might do to respond to the problems that their people are going to face as a result. I don't know if that's a helpful or direct response, but that's how I think about what you've just raised.
No, thank you. I won't take much time, but thank you very much. And it is helpful. It's good with somebody with your true, no question, your representation in your part, giving an answer like that. That's helpful in conversations, and a little bit of kind of like reminding people to be respectful and your words are useful, if you don't mind, of kind of like not so much a quotation, but a paraphrase of like, yeah, you all take this seriously. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's a long time executive director of Citizens Climate Lobby, Mark Reynolds, likes to say that he's not sure that his own opinions are going to do much to save the world, but there are some things that will. And so focusing on how to have the right kind of conversations with the right people about those things is more important than expressing his own opinions. And I don't know if I always live by that standard, but I try.
Great. Karen, I see you have your hand up. Oh, you're good. There we go.
There we go. Joe, I really like the concept of this virtual collective engagement in COP from everybody around the world. What I'm struggling with is the disparity between engaging gazillions of people and focusing their discussion on something. Can you tell me a little bit more about the objective of engaging all these people besides the procedural things that you've mentioned already?
Yeah, I mean, so to me, the simplest thing is, let's say there's two things. One is just if there's some shared understanding between the people and their government, it's going to be easier to get things done. That's one thing. But the other thing is, in communities all over the world, almost everything has to change if we're going to solve this problem. And we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk about that fact enough.
That's what I'm struggling with, because the complexities of the challenge are so great that I can well imagine somebody being so totally frustrated by climbing into this virtual space that they walk away and they throw up their hands. And so I'm trying to grasp how one would engage to accomplish something.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And it's very easy when you look at the way decisions are made at national and international levels to get discouraged by the kind of decisions people make. But to me, that points to the fact that you don't address a very complex problem by having a handful of high-level decision makers be the whole story. And I think we need people in communities to have a role. And if they don't, we're going to have bad outcomes, frankly. But the point about everything needs to change. If you have that level of change on the table, and most people in most places have absolutely no say in how their own experience will evolve or what their own talents and capabilities might bring to the challenge, then we're just leaving all of that opportunity untapped. And we're then going to try to impose one-size-fits-all solutions that won't work. There are some things that can work, like if you put a national carbon tax in place, you return revenues to households, and that way most people are not negatively impacted. The economy can change. That's something that can fit very well. But at the local level, people still need to understand what they're going to do so that their infrastructure is resilient, so that they don't see entire streets washed away in one storm. They have some sort of way of preventing that from happening, protecting their community, protecting livelihoods, planning ahead. That's going to look different in all different circumstances. And so to the point about digital engagement, I think, the Citizens Climate, whether it's the US or internationally, our aim is for people to feel that they have a role to play in making policy. That doesn't happen on a digital platform. That happens in engagement with people. So it happens in engaging with their elected officials, with local media, with people in the community, with trusted leaders who can be allies, and with their own teams. We actually call those the 5 levers for building political will, those 5 ways of engaging: government, media, community, trusted leaders, and your own volunteers. if people aren't willing to do that, they're going to be discouraged and they're going to despair. And what we're hoping to do is bring the opportunity to more people to be empowered and to not have that despair, to connect with people in their community, to talk to their leaders, to get involved. And I would just say that briefly, you know, for those of us who were in Washington, D.C. with the Citizen Climate Lobby Conference last week or the week before, you know, this was the first time for a lot of people that happened. There were no in-person meetings with Congress last year, first time since the pandemic. And certainly the first time since the January 6th insurrection. And it was amazing to see that people who were there for the first time, who've never talked to their Republican climate skeptic senator before, came out feeling hopeful and empowered, because those interpersonal conversations change what is possible. That person now has a new climate advisor. They're not only being advised by industry. They're not only being advised by donors. They're hearing from their own constituents, and those constituents now have a personal relationship. So I would just say that the digital platform is a gateway to that. That would be the goal.
You've mentioned climate tax. I'm not sure what words you used. Eric mentioned the theme that was emphasized at the last COP. It seems to me those kinds of thematic focuses are essential to make the kind of advocacy that you're describing work. And that's based on my experience with National Audubon Society and a number of other national groups doing climate lobby weeks back in DC and engaging people in the advocacy process with people in decision-making positions. And my guess is for the group that went to DC that you described last week, they had some kind of training about the topics that were currently of most interest or could be of most interest to the lawmakers, right?
Yes, and in fact, you know,
you just didn't say go in and talk about climate change. You said focus on these things. So I'm wondering, when you have this kind of an international digital platform, what kinds of themes do you focus that discussion of action and process around?
Yeah, so, you know, part of that is demand driven. So what are people interested in following? One area that we've been very seriously focusing on, Istais will probably smile when I say this, is non-market approaches under Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement. Sounds very wonky, but it's basically every single thing countries do to cooperate that is not emissions trading. It could be financial regulations, carbon border adjustments. It could even be military bases having renewable energy portfolios. All of those non-market international cooperative arrangements can be transformational for accelerating global climate policy. And that's embedded in the Paris Agreement. So we're emphasizing that as a place where people should really think through how they can advise governments at different levels about what something like that might look like if it's successful for them. But, you know, food systems is another one. The types of things that amount to national carbon prices and that can then be internationally negotiated, that all play a role in this international space. Finance, what it looks like and who has a say in it, that type of thing. And of course, you know, action for climate empowerment and engagement. These are all thematic discussion threads that are part of the digital platform and that we'll be seeing people go deeper into in coming months.
Thank you.
Great questions, Karen. Santos.
Yeah, I would like to add, yes, Joe is always in the non-market conversations. I follow more broad topics like climate finance and more specifically around loss and damage and you know, action for climate empowerment. So we make sure in the platform, first of all, it is connected to our Earth diplomacy workshops. So people do receive a training before going in about the geopolitics behind. Then after we make sure that we curate what are the side events that are connected to those different areas. And these areas are oceans. It definitely depends on the conference, because we don't necessarily decide what's on the conference, but we have like oceans, we have lands, which we connect with food systems, and then we have the more like climate finance, and then we have climate justice, in which we kind of like bridging like what is like loss and damage, and then action for climate empowerment. And all of this is very important to make sure that people have access. And I think the premise of the platform is that the more people looking at and engaging with these commitments, the more work can happen once they go back home. Like that is not an exhaustive, and I'm sure Joe gave a more detail before, but I think like that is the objective, right? Like that people have told us in using and after being in part of the platform, that they feel more empowered and they feel very connected to the decisions. We don't get to tell them if they feel hopeful or not. Sometimes we don't feel hopeful when we come out of the sessions, but that's more on making sure that also people outside are feeling what what the negotiations are. So I think like that is all important. Not necessarily we need to be happy about what's happening. Sometimes we need to be mad, and then go and call some of the people at the national level. So yeah.
It is the top of the hour, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time, especially Joe and Istais, who joined us today and are very, very busy. So I'm just very pleased with the discussion and think that it was very informative. So thank you, Joe, for giving us the rundown, and Istais for sharing your thoughts as well. Thank you, everyone, for asking great questions. We'll see you next Tuesday. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Lynn. Thanks.
Bye.